A Toronto morning that feels like late winter but reads like early spring, a few degrees above zero, a bit of rain in the mix. While on the ice, the Leafs are chasing answers, and in Washington, the Supreme Court just drew a sharper line around presidential power that could ripple straight into Canada's next trade talks. And later in the brief, the one timeline that matters most, when Canada and the U.S. sit down for the CUSMA review, and what each side is signaling before that meeting. Toronto's weather first. Expect rain today with temperatures up near 5 degrees. And a quick sports reset. The Maple Leafs dropped a 4-2 decision in Tampa as the Lightning made it 6 straight wins. Nikita Kucherov drove the story, his 30th goal of the season plus 2 assists, and Toronto was left chasing the game in the third. For the Blue Jays, a notable roster note. Max Scherzer is expected to return on a 1-year deal reported at $3 million. He's 41 now, and last season's regular season numbers were uneven, a 5.19 ERA, but his postseason work was steadier. It's a low-cost bet on experience, depth, and innings, if his health holds. Turning now to the bigger stakes, the Canada-US trade picture, because 2 things happened close together that are easy to miss if you only catch the headlines. First, a U.S. Supreme Court ruling has limited one of the tools presidents have leaned on to move quickly on trade. The court found that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. In plain terms, that narrows unilateral presidential authority to slap tariffs on imports by calling it an emergency action under that law. Here's the key point. This is less about one set of tariffs and more about the boundaries of how tariffs can be imposed and how predictable the rules are for countries like Canada that sell heavily into the U.S. market. Now, the immediate follow-on, the Trump administration moved to adjust its approach. On February 20th, President Donald Trump signed new measures updating the U.S. trade framework in response to the ruling, shifting the legal and policy mechanisms so the White House can keep acting, but in ways that better fit what the court says the statute allows. Why it matters now is timing. Canada and the U.S. are heading toward the mandatory review of CUSMA, the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement, and the atmosphere around that review is already tense. You've got tariff talk in public and bargaining in private. Canada's Minister for North American Trade, Dominic LeBlanc, says he'll meet U.S. Trade Representative Greer in Washington late next week. LeBlanc's tone has been guardedly optimistic, pointing to a practical detail. When the U.S. announced new tariffs, many Canadian exports still kept a CUSMA exemption, and the reporting suggests Canada's effective tariff rate landed around 4.9%. At the same time, Greer has publicly suggested any deal with Canada needs higher tariffs, so the messaging isn't aligned. The risk here is a split-screen reality, cordial technical talks behind closed doors, paired with political pressure out in the open. That can make negotiations feel unstable, even if the machinery of the agreement is still running. And that connects to something else showing up in Canadian public opinion. Polling and commentary are capturing a more pessimistic Canadian mood about the United States, with one poll suggesting Canadians are far more likely to describe the U.S. as a security threat than China. Some analysts have gone further, arguing the U.S. is sliding towards something like dictatorship. What's important to hold on to is what we can actually observe. The Supreme Court ruling itself is a visible check on executive power, and the administration's response, changing legal mechanisms after the decision, is another signal that institutions are still functioning, even amid sharp political conflict. Congressional committees are meeting, courts are ruling, and the U.S. is still on the calendar for midterm elections, with the entire House and a third of the Senate up. That doesn't settle the question of where policy goes next, but it does help separate high uncertainty from no guardrails. Mid-episode reference to keep in mind, that LeBlanc-Greer meeting next week is one of the first concrete milestones where we'll see whether the public posture lines up with the private negotiating tone. Back in Canadian federal politics, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre used a speech to the Economic Club of Canada to argue Canada should focus on what it can control at home, and he was more direct than before in criticizing Trump's trade rhetoric. He also laid out a menu of leverage tools, an all-party CUSMA working group, and even the idea of a strategic stockpile of critical minerals. The practical takeaway there is not the politics, it's the direction of travel. Ottawa is starting to talk more openly about negotiation leverage, supply chain choke points, and diversification, rather than assuming stability. Before we wrap, one domestic policy note to watch beyond trade, because it has real day-to-day impact in Ontario. Family health teams are warning that underpaid allied health staff, nurses, social workers, dietitians, and others are becoming harder to recruit and retain. They say funding hasn't kept up with inflation or competing salaries in hospitals, and the concern is that even if Ontario hits its target of attaching people to a primary care provider on paper, access could still be thin if the workforce underneath that system keeps eroding. Final piece to watch heading into the weekend. On trade, watch for two things. What comes out of that Washington meeting next week? Even small wording changes can matter. And whether the U.S. signals it will keep using CUSMA exemptions as a pressure valve while bigger tariff fights continue. And on the Canadian side, watch whether Parliament can find any real cross-party alignment on the CUSMA review strategy, because the timeline is moving, whether Ottawa is unified or not. That's the brief for Friday, February 27.